a once fearless police officer, now bound to a wheelchair, betrayed by the man she loved. He pushed her from the mountain's edge into Montana's frozen silence, but death never came. Because faith ran toward her, on four legs. Ranger, a battle-scarred German shepherd, forged by duty, guided by love. Through ice, wind, and darkness, he refused to let her story end. They say loyalty needs no words, but this one barked against death itself. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a story of divine loyalty, the kind only heaven could have written. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe a dog's love can outlive betrayal, hit subscribe and type Amen in the comments. The wind drifted low across the Montana highlands, weaving through pine branches glazed in white frost. Inside a wooden cabin nestled beneath the ridge, the faint glow of a lantern trembled against the storm's howl. Emily Carter sat near the window, her wheelchair half turned toward the fire, a thin wool blanket over her lap. The flicker of flame caught the silver of her police badge hanging beside her, one she hadn't worn since the explosion. Once she had been a force of nature. Sharp brown eyes, a lean frame built from years in uniform, her hair the color of autumn chestnuts always tied in a low knot. But the blast that shattered her legs left more than scars. It buried the sound of laughter in her voice. Now, every breath she took carried the quiet discipline of a soldier who'd survived too much. At her feet lay Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat streaked in gray. His ears twitched at every gust of wind. Ranger had served beside Emily in the K9 unit. Fast, fearless, a dog who once charged through smoke to pull a wounded officer to safety. He bore a faint scar over his right shoulder, a memento from shrapnel that missed her heart but found his flesh. Since her accident, he'd become her shadow, guarding, watching, understanding. Tonight, his eyes never left her, as if he sensed the storm carried something more than snow. The door opened with a groan, letting in a rush of cold. Mark Carter stepped inside, brushing frost from his dark coat. He was broad-shouldered, early 40s, the kind of man who looked built to command, but time had stripped the softness from his face, leaving angular lines and a permanent shadow beneath his blue eyes. Once a firearms instructor at the police academy, Mark had been charming, gregarious, persuasive, but the last 2 years had carved bitterness into him like winter carving stone. The loss of Emily's career, her paralysis, and the mounting bills had turned his pride to dust. His smile had become a tool, and tonight, even that seemed tired. He crossed the room slowly, holding a thick scarf in his hand. "It's beautiful out," he said softly, looping it gently around her shoulders. "The snow's fresh, untouched. Thought maybe we could go see it. A night like this doesn't come often." Emily hesitated, glancing toward the window where flakes spiraled like falling ash. "It's late, Mark. You shouldn't be out in that wind." But his voice came smooth, practiced. "You always said the world looks different when it's quiet. Let's go, just a few minutes. I'll push the chair." Something in her chest fluttered, a memory of who they were before the silence set in. She smiled faintly, her guard softening. "All right. Just for a bit." Outside, the world was white and endless. The cabin lights faded behind them as Mark pushed the wheelchair along a narrow trail carved into the snow. Each turn of the wheel made a soft, whispering sound against the frost. Ranger barked once from the porch, tugging at his chain, but Mark's voice cut through the night. "Stay." His tone was firm, colder than the air itself. The trail wound upward, through tall pines bending under the storm. Emily breathed in deeply, the scent of pine, of earth sleeping beneath winter's weight. "It's peaceful," she whispered. Mark didn't answer. His jaw worked as though grinding old thoughts. He'd rehearsed this, every step, every word. The insurance forms were signed weeks ago. Her policy, her pension, her estate, all of it waiting to be claimed. He told himself she wanted rest, that this would be mercy. Yet his pulse raced, and the guilt rose like bile. He forced it down. The summit opened before them, an overlook called Widow's Point, where the land dropped suddenly into the frozen valley below. The snow had drifted higher here, curling over the cliff like pale breath. The wind howled through the ravine, swallowing sound. Mark stopped behind her. His hands gripped the handles of the wheelchair. Emily turned slightly, a small smile ghosting across her lips. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" His eyes flickered, something close to sorrow flashing through before dying. "Yeah," he said. "Almost perfect." A long pause. The only sound was the creak of the chair in the wind. "Em," he said quietly, voice cracking like ice. "You know I tried. I really did." She frowned, confused. "Mark, what are you—" He leaned forward, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." Before the words sank in, his hands released the brakes. The chair lurched. Wheels spun against loose snow. Emily's breath caught. Then the world dropped out from beneath her. A scream tore through the wind, swallowed by the canyon below. Back at the cabin, Ranger's ears shot up. The chain snapped taut, then snapped again until it broke free of its post. The dog bolted, a streak of motion against the snow, his paws hammering the frozen ground. His bark echoed through the valley, raw, frantic, cutting through the storm. On the ridge, Mark stood frozen, watching the darkness where she had vanished. The snow fell heavier now, covering tracks, muting guilt. He breathed hard, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The world around him went still, but somewhere below, faint and far, the echo of a dog's howl rose, defiant, unbroken. He turned back toward the cabin, leaving the cliff to its silence. Behind him, the storm devoured everything, the path, the footprints, and the man he once pretended to be. Down below, through the white roar of wind, Ranger raced toward the sound of a heartbeat he could still smell, weak, fading, but alive. Snow fell in a steady hush, thick enough to blur the edges between sky and earth. The mountains of Montana loomed like ghosts in the white distance, and beneath one jagged ridge the world was reduced to wind, cold, and the fragile pulse of a dying woman. Emily Carter lay crumpled against a broken boulder, her wheelchair twisted beside her like a shattered skeleton of metal. Her breath came in short bursts, fogging the air. The fall had knocked the wind out of her, and pain pulsed from her shoulder down to her ribs. Her police jacket, dark blue, torn at the sleeve, was soaked through, the silver badge dim under the frost. She tried to move, but her legs were nothing but weight. She hadn't felt them for years, and now the rest of her body seemed eager to join their silence. Her mind flickered through the last seconds before the drop. Mark's voice, low and trembling. "I can't do this anymore." Then the release, the shock, the betrayal that hit harder than the fall itself. Above her, on the ridgeline swallowed by the storm, Mark Carter stood with the posture of a man who had spent years convincing himself that his sins were logical. He rubbed his hands together, not from cold, but from nerves. The leather gloves creaked as he wiped away a faint smear of blood on the knuckle. Hers, from where she had grabbed at him in that desperate second before gravity won. Mark was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with the kind of hardened jaw that made people believe him when he spoke. Once handsome, now his face had sharpened under the strain of resentment. The years had dug lines around his eyes, creases that used to form when he laughed, but now only deepened with bitterness. There had been a time when he was proud of her, proud to be the husband of Officer Carter. But as months turned into years of hospitals, therapy bills, and her quiet refusal to give up, he felt his own life fading behind hers. What had once been love turned into envy. What had once been protection twisted into a cold calculation. He stared down into the blur of snow and shadow where she had fallen. Nothing moved. The storm would take her, he told himself. The snow would bury the rest. His voice was steady when he pulled out his phone and dialed. "My wife. She's missing," he said, pitching his tone perfectly between panic and disbelief. "She took her chair out for some air before the storm hit. I think she got caught up somewhere on the trail." The operator asked for details. He gave them with measured calm, even adding a tremor in his voice near the end. Then he hung up and whispered into the wind, "I'm sorry, Emily." Though even he didn't know whether it was for her or for himself. Down below, through the screaming snow, Ranger bounded forward, following the faint metallic scent that clung to the air. The German shepherd was built like a soldier, broad chest, powerful legs, and fur the color of burned copper and ash. Snow clung to his muzzle, but his amber eyes were fierce with purpose. He had known pain, the kind that makes even animals remember. Years ago, in a drug raid gone wrong, he'd been caught in an explosion meant for the officers he was trained to protect. It had left a small patch of missing fur along his shoulder, a scar Emily used to rub gently while whispering, "You're my hero too." Now he carried that memory like a vow. When he saw the broken wheelchair below, he let out a sharp bark that cut through the wind like a flare. Emily stirred at the sound. Her vision blurred, but when she saw the shape bounding through the white, a flash of tan and black fur, something deep within her sparked. "Ranger," she croaked. The dog reached her within seconds, circling, whining, pawing at the snow. He pressed his body close to hers for warmth, his breath steaming. Emily reached out with trembling fingers, brushing his ear. "Good boy. Help me." Ranger lowered his head, sniffed her wounds, then bit gently at her sleeve, tugging. The motion sent pain through her shoulder, and she gasped. "No, not that way," she whispered. But the dog didn't stop. He dug fiercely, flinging snow aside, his claws scraping rock until he could wedge his body closer and pull. Inch by inch, he dragged her torso away from the sharp edge of the stone that had pinned her. His paws bled from the ice, but he didn't slow. On the ridge above, Mark turned away, his figure shrinking into the white. Each step back toward the cabin was heavier than the last, though he told himself it was just the snow. He had practiced this moment in his head 100 times. What to say, how to act. But now, the silence felt too loud. His father had once told him that guilt is like frost. It seeps in slowly until it cracks the strongest walls. Mark tried to ignore the memory. "She's gone," he muttered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. In the valley below, Emily's consciousness faded in waves. Her thoughts drifted to the night she met Mark, back when he was still kind. He used to bring her black coffee during late shifts, tease her about how serious she looked with her hair pulled back tight. That man had vanished somewhere between his failures and her survival. She blinked, tears freezing on her lashes. "Why, Mark?" she whispered into the wind. "Why wasn't I enough?" Ranger barked again, this time louder, desperate. He raised his muzzle and howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the mountainsides. Somewhere far below, that cry traveled through the air like a message meant for anyone still listening. Miles away, in the small town of Coldwater, Detective James Holloway sat alone in his office, the glow from the radio scanner painting his face in pale green. Holloway was in his early 40s, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of grief had bent his frame. His dark hair was flecked with gray at the temples, and a rough shadow of stubble lined his jaw. His left hand, scarred from an old bullet wound, trembled when he reached for his coffee. The room smelled of paper, dust, and cheap whiskey. Holloway wasn't the kind of man who liked company anymore. He'd lost that privilege when his partner bled out beside him 3 winters ago. The woman who saved him that night was Emily Carter. He still remembered her voice on the radio, calm under fire. "Hold on, James. Don't move. Backup's coming." It had been years, but he never forgot. When the call came in, possible missing person, female, wheelchair-bound, last seen near Widow's Point, his heart froze. The dispatcher's voice crackled. "Name's Emily Carter." Holloway didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, his flashlight, and an old device from his desk drawer, a small receiver that blinked faintly red. It was a signal tracker, designed years ago for K-9 field ops. Emily's dog, Ranger, had a chip embedded in his collar, a standard tracker used for police canines. Holloway had been there the day they installed it. He stood at the doorway for a long second, the storm pressing against the glass, and whispered, "Hang on, Carter." Then he stepped into the night. Back on the mountain, Ranger pawed at Emily's chest, whimpering. She stirred again, her fingers brushing his fur. "Stay with me," she murmured. The dog pressed his body against hers, trying to share heat, and looked up to the ridge where the storm swallowed the trail of the man who had left them both for dead. His instincts burned brighter than the cold. Somewhere deep inside him, something said this wasn't over. And as the snow thickened, covering them both under the frozen veil, the first faint beep of a signal receiver came alive, miles away, in a detective's trembling hand. The night roared like a living thing. The snow no longer fell softly, but whipped sideways in furious sheets, blurring every line between sky and earth. The pines groaned beneath the wind's weight, their branches cracking like gunfire. Down in the ravine, Ranger moved through the chaos, his dark sable coat drenched, his paws sinking deep into the frozen crust. He was 6 years old, a German shepherd built for endurance, his muscles thick beneath fur streaked with gray. But tonight, he was more than muscle. He was instinct, devotion, and memory. His ears twitched at the faintest sound, and beneath the storm's scream, he caught it again, a whisper. "Ranger, good boy." The voice was weak, breaking through wind and pain. Emily's voice. He whined softly, pressing forward through a narrow passage where the snow had drifted into ridges. Each movement was deliberate. He remembered her training, how she taught him to track breath, not footsteps. The air smelled of iron and ice, and somewhere beneath it, the faint, familiar scent of her blood. Ranger's heartbeat quickened. He pushed past a fallen branch, his claws scraping rock, until he saw a shadow half buried beneath a snowbank. It was her. Emily Carter, his handler, his partner, the woman whose scent meant home. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, hair matted with snow. The faint beam of her flashlight flickered beside her, casting a trembling light across her police badge still pinned to her chest. He nudged her arm gently, then barked once, short, urgent, like a command to herself to wake. Emily stirred, her eyelashes fluttering. "Ranger," she whispered again, the word almost lost in the wind. She tried to lift her hand, but her arm barely responded. Her thoughts drifted, heavy as the storm. Pain pulsed through her ribs, and memories mixed with snow, the echo of Mark's voice, the quiet tension in his eyes before the fall, and the crushing realization that love could turn lethal. Her heart broke twice, once for the betrayal, and once for the man she once believed he was. Ranger pawed at the snow, uncovering a thermal blanket that had fallen from the broken emergency pack. He bit the fabric, tugging it open, and nosed it over her body. It wasn't much, but it was warmth. Then, with careful licks, he cleaned the frost from her cheek. His body pressed close, his fur steaming faintly from his own heat. The world around them howled, but within that small cocoon of breath and heartbeat, something human, something holy, remained. Miles away, in a small wooden house at the edge of Helena, Mark Carter stood at the kitchen counter, the storm battering against the windows like ghosts demanding entry. The house was warm, the fire humming softly in the hearth, yet Mark felt cold beneath his skin. He had changed into a clean shirt, the dark flannel that Emily once said made his eyes look kind. On the table before him lay a folder of documents: the insurance policy, the updated will, the medical bills stacked beside them. His reflection wavered in the black surface of his coffee cup as he stirred it slowly. Mark Carter was a man who once dreamed of control. His father, a military sergeant, had raised him to believe that weakness was sin and emotion a defect. For years, Mark lived by that creed, structured, precise, the kind of man who believed every problem had a mechanical solution. But life had mocked that belief. When Emily was injured on duty, his discipline collapsed into panic. The woman he loved became a constant reminder of what he'd lost: his career, his reputation, his comfort. Tonight, as he stared at the neat row of numbers, $750,000, he told himself it wasn't murder. It was mercy. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness coat his tongue, and smiled faintly. The storm outside was loud enough to hide everything. Back in the mountains, the wind tore through the trees with the sound of 1,000 broken prayers. Ranger stood guard beside Emily, his body shielding her from the cold. Every few minutes, he barked, sharp, rhythmic, the sound carrying up through the canyon like a beacon. And miles away, in the cab of a rusted Ford pickup cutting through the snow, a faint beep pulsed through the static of a radio receiver. Detective James Holloway leaned closer to the device on the dashboard. The signal was weak, but it was there, a steady, rhythmic tone. He exhaled, a cloud of condensation filling the truck. "Come on, boy," he muttered. "Give me a direction." The receiver blinked again, a single green pulse. Holloway gripped the wheel and squinted through the windshield, the snow slashing against the glass. He was a tall man, his shoulders broad, but posture slightly slouched from years of carrying burdens no badge could erase. His face was carved by sleepless nights, gray stubble along a square jaw, crow's feet at the corners of eyes the color of riverstone. The scar along his left wrist, a thin white line, was the only visible reminder of the night Emily Carter had saved him. James Holloway was not a man built for softness. After his partner died in a failed hostage rescue 5 years ago, he'd stopped believing in grace. But Emily had changed that, if only for a while. She had this way of seeing the light in every wreckage, of treating broken people like they were worth rebuilding. Now, hearing her name on a missing persons report felt like the universe playing a cruel joke. He turned the heater higher, though his hands were already warm with adrenaline. "You saved me once, Carter," he said under his breath. "Now it's my turn." At the edge of the Widow's Point Trail, Holloway's truck skidded to a halt. The wind hit him like a wall when he stepped out. Snowflakes clung to his lashes, melted against the warmth of his breath. The flashlight beam wavered across the ground, catching a set of parallel lines etched into the snow. He knelt down, brushing away the top layer with a gloved hand. Wheelchair tracks. They ran straight. No hesitation, no sign of turning. His brow furrowed. "No drag marks," he murmured. "No attempt to stop." The prints ended abruptly at the cliff's edge. He stood slowly, scanning the horizon, then the slope below. "This wasn't an accident," he whispered, voice low, almost reverent. "It's a crime." Below him, far down the mountain, Ranger lifted his head and howled, a deep, mournful cry that cut through the wind. The sound carried upward, threading through the snow, reaching the ears of the man above. Holloway froze, turning toward the echo. His eyes narrowed. He knew that voice. "I'm coming," he said softly, stepping into the storm. The blizzard screamed, the mountain roared, but beneath it all, the sound of one dog's cry refused to fade. It was the heartbeat of loyalty itself, pounding against the silence of betrayal. The storm had broken, but the mountain still breathed its cold silence. Snow fell softly now, in slow spirals, blanketing the world in a deceptive calm. The wind had lost its rage. It whispered instead, carrying the faint echo of a dog's bark across the frozen ridge. Beneath a line of shattered pines, Detective James Holloway moved carefully, his boots sinking into knee-deep drifts. His flashlight beam caught movement ahead, a dark, trembling shape half buried under snow. Holloway's heart clenched as the shape resolved into a German shepherd, his fur heavy with frost. The dog turned sharply, ears pricked, and let out a bark that was half command, half plea. "Ranger," Holloway muttered, pushing forward. "Good boy, I'm here." Ranger's eyes, deep amber and glinting like molten glass, locked on him. He turned, pawing furiously at a mound of snow near a jagged boulder. Holloway dropped to his knees beside him and began digging with his gloved hands. Within moments, he unearthed the pale face of Emily Carter. She lay motionless, skin the color of moonlight, hair tangled with frost, lips blue and trembling even in unconsciousness. Her badge was still pinned to her jacket, dull beneath ice. Holloway's breath caught, not from the cold, but from the shock of seeing her broken body alive. "Emily," he whispered, voice cracking beneath the weight of memory. Holloway had never been a man easily shaken. In his 43 years, he'd seen enough violence to numb a lifetime of conscience. His broad frame and square jaw carried the quiet strength of someone born into hardship, but there was an old weariness in his eyes, gray, sharp, but shadowed by loss. 5 years earlier, A hostage standoff had gone wrong. He'd been hit, bleeding out in a stairwell, and Emily Carter had dragged him to safety through gunfire. She'd saved his life, but the guilt of surviving when his partner didn't had gnawed at him ever since. He owed her more than he could ever say. And now, as he looked down at her half-frozen body, he swore he would not fail her again. "Stay with me, Carter," he said softly, stripping off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. Her chest rose faintly beneath the layers, a shallow, uneven rhythm. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Detective Holloway. I've found her, alive. I repeat, alive. Requesting emergency extraction, Widow's Point, North Slope. And tell them to bring a medic for the dog." Ranger barked once, as if understanding. Emily stirred slightly, her head twitching. Holloway brushed snow from her hair. "Emily, it's James. You're safe now." Her eyelids fluttered, slow and heavy, and a single tear thawed a path down her frozen cheek. Her voice came out cracked and thin, barely audible. "He pushed me." Holloway froze, leaning closer. "Who?" Her eyes opened just enough for the truth to escape her lips. "Mark." The name fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Holloway's expression hardened, the warmth in his face fading into something colder than the mountain around them. "I know," he said quietly, "and I'll prove it." Hours later, the world was no longer white but sterile. The hum of fluorescent lights replaced the whisper of wind. In a small room at Helena General Hospital, Emily lay propped against white pillows, her face pale but alive. Tubes ran from her arm. A heart monitor blinked steadily beside her. Outside the glass, the storm had cleared, revealing the first timid rays of morning light crawling over the peaks. Ranger sat curled at her bedside, bandaged paw resting on the tile floor, his gaze fixed on her like a sentry guarding a throne. Nurses passed quietly, whispering admiration for the dog that had refused to leave her side. Emily's eyes fluttered open again. She could feel the warmth of the room, the steady beat of machines, proof she was still tethered to the living world. But beneath that calm was the memory of betrayal. The moment Mark's hands left her chair, the sound of metal scraping over snow, the rush of falling, the disbelief. She had loved him once, deeply, fiercely, but now all that remained was a hollow ache. He wanted freedom, she thought bitterly, and he thought my death would buy it. The realization made her chest tighten, but she let the pain wash through her. She had been trained to face fear, but betrayal, that was something even years of police work couldn't harden her against. The door creaked open. Mark Carter entered, his features drawn tight, the corners of his mouth set into a practiced expression of worry. He looked every bit the grieving husband, tall, neatly dressed in a gray wool coat, his brown hair combed back with precision. But beneath the veneer of calm, there was something brittle in his blue eyes, a flicker too calculated to be grief. He approached the bed slowly, clutching a paper cup of coffee like a prop. "Emily," he said softly, his voice gentle, almost tremulous. "Thank God you're awake." Ranger's head shot up instantly. The air changed. His fur bristled along his spine, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat. His eyes never left Mark's hands. Mark froze mid-step, mask cracking for an instant, as fear flashed through his expression. "What's wrong with that dog?" he snapped, voice sharper than he intended. From the corner of the room, Holloway straightened. He had been standing near the door, silent until now. His tone came flat, controlled, but each word carried weight. He recognizes the man who hurt his handler. Mark turned sharply, his face paling. "Excuse me?" Holloway took a step forward, eyes narrowed. "We found your wife at the bottom of the ravine. Her wheelchair tracks went straight to the cliff edge. No sign of turning, no struggle. That doesn't happen by accident." Emily's eyes were open now, watching, her pulse quickening on the monitor. Holloway pulled a small evidence bag from his coat pocket, holding it up between them. Inside was a torn leather glove, its edge smeared with blood. "Forensics already confirmed the DNA. It's hers. And the shoe prints at the scene? Same tread as the boots you're wearing right now." Mark's composure fractured. "You can't," he started, but his voice faltered as Ranger rose, stepping between him and Emily. The German shepherd's teeth bared in a silent snarl, his body tense as wire. Mark's hand twitched, as if to defend himself, but Holloway's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Don't bother. The truth doesn't need your permission to stand." Two officers entered the room then, their badges flashing under the sterile lights. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes and freckled skin, stepped forward with handcuffs. Mark backed away instinctively, his face paling as realization took root. "This is a mistake," he stammered, but his voice was already breaking under the weight of inevitability. Holloway didn't respond. He only watched, arms crossed, as the cuffs clicked shut around Mark's wrists. Emily looked at him once, not as a victim, but as a woman who had finally seen the man behind the mask. There was no anger in her gaze, only quiet resolve. Ranger pressed his muzzle against her hand, his body relaxing, as if he too understood justice had come full circle. As Mark was let out, Holloway exhaled for the first time in hours. He looked down at Emily, his voice softening. "You're safe now. He won't hurt you again." She nodded weakly, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," he said, glancing at Ranger. "Thank him." Outside the hospital window, the storm clouds drifted apart, revealing a thin band of sunlight across the white horizon. For the first time in days, Montana was still, and in that fragile calm, truth, like the dawn, finally rose. The Montana winter had returned, calm this time. No howling wind, no furious blizzard, only a soft fall of snow that blanketed the cabin roof like a sigh from the heavens. A year had passed since that night. The valley of Helena was quiet, save for the faint crackle of a fire inside the small wooden cabin perched at the edge of the pine forest. From the porch, the scent of pine resin mixed with gun oil drifted through the air. Emily Carter sat there in her wheelchair, the same one that once rolled toward death, now bearing the marks of resilience. She was 34, her frame slender but strong, her posture upright despite the scars carved deep into her back. Her auburn hair, cut shorter now, brushed her shoulders. Easier to manage, she used to joke with the nurses. The years of pain had refined her features. She no longer looked fragile but resolute, the kind of woman who had stared into darkness and found a way back to light. Her eyes, a shade of stormy blue, held a calm that only survivors knew, the peace that comes not from forgetting, but from forgiving oneself for surviving. On her lap rested a training pistol, matte black with a bright orange safety tip. She steadied it with both hands, her gloves creasing slightly as she adjusted her aim toward a wooden post in the snow. "Focus on the breath," she murmured to herself. She squeezed the trigger. Click. The sound echoed softly, almost blending with the whisper of falling snow. She exhaled, lowering the gun, and smiled faintly. She wasn't trying to be the cop she once was. She was learning to be the teacher she had become. At her feet lay Ranger, the German shepherd, who had rewritten the story of her life. Now 7 years old, he was heavier, his coat thicker with winter, dark sable with streaks of silver running down his spine like threads of light. His amber eyes tracked her every movement with quiet devotion. A faint scar along his front paw, a relic from that night, was the only visible reminder of the storm they'd survived together. He had become famous since then. Every police recruit in Helena knew his name. But to Emily, he was still just Ranger, the partner who never gave up, the heartbeat beside her silence. Inside the cabin, the smell of brewed coffee filled the air. Detective James Holloway stood by the kitchen window, hands tucked into the pockets of a brown field jacket. He had grown older too, the silver in his hair more prominent, though his frame remained as solid as ever. He watched Emily from the window with a quiet pride that he never voiced aloud. His life had been rebuilt piece by piece since that winter. The kind of slow, deliberate rebuilding only men burdened by guilt could understand. The case had closed, justice served, and yet the image of her falling through the snow still haunted him in flashes. She never blamed him for not arriving sooner. She only said, "You came when you were meant to." Somehow, that sentence had healed something he didn't realize was still bleeding. He walked out onto the porch, the wooden planks creaking under his boots. "Your aim's better than half the rookies at the academy," he said, his voice carrying that dry, amused rasp she had come to associate with him. Emily glanced over her shoulder, her lips curving into a smile. "I teach them," she said. "Someone has to set the standard." Her tone was light, but the pride in her voice was genuine. After months of recovery and therapy, she had returned to the force, not as a field officer, but as a K-9 training instructor. Ranger, too, had found his place there, helping new recruits understand not only obedience, but trust. "He listens better than most cadets," Holloway remarked, nodding toward the dog. Ranger's tail thumped softly in agreement. Emily's gaze drifted to the horizon, to the pale sunlight breaking through the clouds over the distant mountain range. It was the same ridge where everything had changed. For months, she couldn't look at it without feeling her chest tighten. But now, she could. The grief had cooled into memory, the fear into gratitude. "Mark's appeal got denied last week," Holloway said quietly. Emily's hand stilled on her lap. For a moment, her expression didn't change. No satisfaction, no sorrow, just acceptance. "Good," she said after a pause. "Not because I hate him, but because it means I can stop waiting for the next storm." Holloway nodded. There was nothing left to add. The two sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt like closure, not emptiness. Snowflakes gathered on the porch railing, melting into small beads that glistened in the faint light. A small, golden medal rested on the table beside Emily, her police valor commendation, the one she had once received for saving Holloway's life years ago. The medal caught a shaft of sunlight and flared, scattering warm gold across her face. She lifted it between her fingers, studying the tiny engravings. "Funny," she murmured. "I used to think this meant bravery." She looked down at Ranger, his head resting on her knee. "Now I think it just means never giving up, even when no one's coming." Ranger blinked slowly, his tail brushing against her wheel. She reached down, scratching behind his ears. "You're the real hero, you know," she whispered. The dog responded with a soft huff, pressing his nose against her glove. For a moment, the air around them felt sacred, as if every pain, every loss, had led to this quiet peace. As the sun began to dip, a group of young officers emerged from the path leading up to the cabin, trainees from the new K-9 division. They carried notebooks, collars, and training vests, laughter cutting through the stillness. One of them, a woman no older than 22 with freckles and wind-chapped cheeks, called out, "Sergeant Carter, we're ready for the afternoon session." Emily smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "All right," she said, pushing her wheels forward. "Let's see what you've got." Ranger stood and stretched, his breath misting in the cold, ready to follow. Holloway watched as she rolled down the path, Ranger trotting beside her, teacher and legend side by side. He stayed on the porch for a moment longer, letting the warmth in his chest settle. For the first time in years, he believed the mountain no longer held ghosts, only stories worth remembering. That evening, as the last light of winter filtered through the clouds, Emily sat once more on the porch, Ranger curled at her feet. The air shimmered faintly with the promise of spring. She looked at the dog and smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "People say angels don't have wings," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the still air. "But sometimes we find them in the snow, with 4 legs and 1 loyal heart." The camera of memory would have lingered there, on the woman who found courage after betrayal, and the dog who turned pain into faith. Together, they watched the last light fade behind the mountains that had once tried to take everything, and now gave them peace instead. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or light. They arrive quietly, in a heartbeat, a second chance, or the warmth of a loyal friend who refuses to leave. Emily thought her story ended on that mountain, but God had another plan. Through pain, through betrayal, he sent a sign, not in angels with wings, but in a German shepherd named Ranger, whose love became the hand that pulled her back to life. Maybe that's the lesson for all of us, that faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the ones who stay when the world walks away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe, and type Amen to bless every loyal soul, both the people and the dogs, who remind us that God still works through love.